Hello, everyone. We're going to give people a few seconds to join. Welcome, welcome. As you join, make sure that as you have any questions throughout the presentation today, you add them to the chat directly and you make sure to send it to everyone and not just to host and panelists. We'll be having a bit of a Q&A towards the end. And as we wait, add where you're calling from in the chat. I'm calling from Montreal today. Heart from Montreal. Love it, love it. Atlanta, Gainesville. Amazing. Gainesville sounds much warmer than here right now, although it's starting to get better. Toronto. Awesome. Alrighty. So, without further ado, welcome to today's Tigerhall webinar. Our session features Nelly Wartoff, who is CEO of Tigerhall and chairperson of the ECLC. Today's topic is industry best practices for change activation in pharmaceutical companies. Nelly, take it away.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this Thursday afternoon across the country and across the border as well in Canada. So thank you for being here. It's good to see you. What we wanted to do is a session dedicated to pharma companies. The background to this is that we work with a lot of pharma companies. So for Tigerhall, the work that we do in change activation, pharmaceutical companies is the number one segment that we serve together with healthcare. We also have quite a bit of banking, insurance, consumer goods, and so on. We wanted to do something dedicated to pharma for a few reasons. It's the pace of change in this industry that we notice is quite different to other industries. The introduction of AI in basically all things pharma, especially clinical trials, but so many other areas when it comes to drug development, speed of go-to-market. It's a ton of AI happening in pharma right now. And three, they tend to be fairly mature in their change activation practices and how they think about these things, both as organizations and as change and transformation teams. So we thought that even for people who are not in pharma companies, it might be interesting to learn from some best practices in how some of the more mature organizations do this. So everything that I'll be sharing today, everything is condensed and consolidated. So I'm not going to speak about any particular clients that we work with, no names, no practices from that lens. But it's more, think of this as an amalgamation of what actually works and what do these companies do, and what is so unique and special about pharma, and what can you do in change activation in these kind of scenarios, industries with the kind of audiences pharma has and so on. So the intent today is to share some of those best practices, and also I'll be pretty tactical and hands-on and like show some of these things so that you'll see what it actually looks like under the hood as well. So without further ado, let's start with just seeing like on that maturity point that I mentioned that many companies in pharmaceutical are very mature. Let's take a look at who's in the group here today and just see which of the following best describes your change activation maturity right now, and see a little bit where we stand. We'll give it 10 more seconds. Take some time to read. Okay, so none are strategic, which is good reason to be here, so welcome. Quite a few are building a system, so moving towards that always-on capability, driving business outcomes, but not there yet. So 50% are there. We have a couple that are in the reactive bucket and some project capable as well. Okay, awesome. That gives us a good understanding of who's in the room. Okay, so what is so special about pharma, right? And I alluded to some of this in the introduction, but what is it that is special about this industry? Why is so much change, so much transformation happening in these large organizations? I mentioned AI. And if you look at the data behind it, if you look at pharma CIOs, 84% of them are increasing AI platform investment in the next 12 months. So that is higher than other industries. And when you look at the amount of dollars that go into AI and other technologies, it's also higher than other industries. So very, very in the forefront of AI. And if you look at the third statistics here, that's what kind of partly explains that as well, because we're seeing it's a $300 billion patent cliff that is coming up, which is the highest, is an all-time high when it comes to patents expiring, which means that pharma companies are under enormous pressure to develop new drugs, file new IP, find new drugs that they can sell, right? And that's where you see a lot of those convene, where it's like we're losing patents, so we need to build new ones. And that's why you're seeing so much investment in AI, because AI equals speed in many areas. So the speed of developing drugs, the speed of taking them to market. And when we look across the industry, the competition between them is very, very intense. And then together with that, you have, especially last year, there were a lot of roles that were being cut. So you also have growing pressure on the change and transformation teams. And when I look at the companies that we work with, which are brands that you will be familiar with, the average size of a transformation team tends to be around like 10 people. Some are as small as like 2, 3. Some have better sizes of like 20, 30, 40 people, but it tends to be around 10 people. And then when you have a lot of these roles being cut, a lot more AI coming in, a lot of that business pressure to develop drugs quicker, that is what resulting in this, I think, unique pressure that is like not as strongly felt in some other industries yet. And I do think that this kind of pressure will come to other industries with evolvement of AI and so on. But pharma is one of the first ones to see it, given the combination with the patent cliff they're experiencing. And there are a few dynamics that make this harder as well. One is that there's constant reorganization. I mean, this is not unique to pharma. This is happening everywhere. But especially pharma tends to be a lot of restructuring, innovation, and like it's always on change. So I think one of the reasons that we're seeing pharma companies being more mature in, for example, change activation, with many having had their offices around for like 10 years, right? Whereas in other industries, they're just now standing up transformation offices, change management offices. Pharma is like 5 to 10 years ahead. And I think that's because they've had this always on change going on for a longer period of time. So the need to adapt to an always on continuous way of driving change and transformation has been there for longer. And then you have, of course, the compliance, the regulatory environment. This is similar to banking, if anyone is in financial services in the group, but that adds more complexity as well. And then I think a third one, which is fairly unique, is that you have so many different audiences with so many different languages. And we're going to speak a bit about this when we look at the alignment and how we align, because if you think of pharma companies, you have a very, very large audience. There are scientists and physicians. So like these are people that are not the MBA kind of like people with a business language, right? They're totally educated in other areas and care about different things. So coming to them with a classic business language of like ROI and adoption and transformation, like it's almost seen by them as more buzzwords, because that's not the kind of language that they respect many times, because scientists respect scientific language and accuracy and so on. So coming with corporate buzzwords doesn't really land well with them. So that makes it fairly unique as well. So if we take that then to a change management, like the traditional lens, why it's failing a bit differently is that when you look at the initiatives, many times it's funded by project, and pharma tends to have a lot of money. It's generally rich companies with high gross margins doing well and so on. But it's many times where the budgets are by different initiatives. So it tends to be this project funding approach. A few have moved to a more centralized overall capability kind of view of like seeing this always on change, but there's still quite a lot of that like initiative project-based funding that is happening. And we know transformation offices that have zero budget, for example, like they don't have anything to work with. It's all with the different initiatives. And then you have those small teams in combination with a very high speed. And what we mentioned around the different audiences, that doing that kind of generic activation with both business audiences and more scientific audiences is becoming a pretty big challenge. So when we instead look at the change activation model, I think the reason that we're seeing so much interest from pharma especially is that The alignment piece is what speaks to that business and science, and the ability to translate to different groups, different audiences, that personalized messaging. So we'll look at some best practices there. And then adoption, which is the second A in the activation model, and how do we drive adoption and ownership? And we're seeing a few companies here doing more leader-led change, more decentralization, like different champion networks. So we'll look at some best practices there. And then adaptation, which is how do we monitor what is actually happening and being more agile. And adaptation has a very direct link with speed, because the more adaptive you are, the more you can adapt to the new reality next week and what is happening with different audiences and how they react. The more adaptive you are, the faster you can move. Because the slowest way of doing change is sitting in a boardroom with a 6-month plan and then release that plan onto the organization and hope that everything goes well. And usually doesn't. In week 2, you already have issues. So being able to constantly listen and adapt to how different people are going through it and how the changes is progressing and evolving is a very big thing. So if we start with looking at alignment, then a couple of things when it comes to these different audiences. Number one is to speak the language of your stakeholders, right? And this is nothing new, but I think it's amplified even more in pharmaceutical, and how important that is, and how different it is to speak to these different audiences. Many tend to think of segmentation when we think of audience segmentation as doing that by role. So you might have clinical and commercial and medical affairs and R&D and so on. So kind of like a functional split is where many start. But then what is the real unlock is when you start using different vocabulary, different words, and that language that they resonate with as well. And if you take something like clinical trial scientist, for example, and a marketing person, very different lingo, like the amount of information they want, the kind of information, what they care about, being able to literally speak the language of your stakeholders becomes very, very critical. So being able to then personalize both the communications, the enablement, everything being role-specific, context-based, so that people get different things based on who they are, what they do, and so on, but also very much in that language. So if we take a look at some of the things that you would do in change activation, for example, is you can, of course, do the department name. So for example, if you want to target people in specific departments and areas, think like R&D, product, like all of these different areas, like market access, medical affairs, and you can get to people in those functions combined with country. So this is like your classic split and classic segmentation. But then other areas that are popular would be, for example, like employee start date, like tenure is one of the most underrated points to personalize based on. So people have started in the organization in the last, say, 6 months, probably need more context and more information understanding before being thrown into something right away. So being able to go directly to the people who are different tenured in the organization. And then combining that with what they do. So now in this demo instance, it's an SAP workflow. You might use more specific clinical trial platforms or the ERPs, but being able to speak to different people based on their adoption of different tools. So if you roll out AI tools or different workflow tools, then being able to see what exactly are they doing and how often are they doing it. So simple example, someone has created a purchase order at least one time in the last 30 days. That's an example of workflow targeting. And then being able to also add targeting and personalization based on how they respond to the change. So this is where a big part of that personalization comes in as well. So if you have something like, maybe you have an AI readiness self-assessment. If you're rolling out AI in clinical trials, you might want to target people and say, like, how confident are you in using AI-powered tools in your daily scientific or operational workflows? This might go out to people who have scientific workflows, and then the people who are at least an 8 out of 10 on that assessment, higher in AI readiness, you want to target them differently compared to people who might be like maximum 3, for example. So being able to combine those different criteria to get to very specific audiences. So beyond just like, where do they work and what do they do, but also what exactly are their day-to-day actions? How do they respond to different changes? All of these different data points in combination. So when we talk about the data points here, we talk about the demographics. So that would be like employee start date and country and so on. And then workflow actions, which is what are they actually doing in these systems? So that's a big piece that you're able to adapt to, right? by seeing, are people adopting it? Are they not adopting it? And then what we call the response data, which is what are they responding? And you can do this qualitatively as well. So for example, everyone who says anything around, say, AI as an example, then you can target that as a specific group. So both quantitative feedback and qualitative feedback. And then what happens when you roll out activation to them is you select who is the target audience for something that you want to say. So you might have a strategy of like, this is, you say you're rolling out a new clinical trial management platform, for example. And then you might select the different groups like the R&D scientists, computational researchers, manufacturing and quality leaders. And then the system learns about what do they actually do and what do they care about. So for example, their context operational, they care about reliability, compliance, and safety. That will then be taken into the podcast, video, anything that they will receive. So that's where that translation happens. So when we think of the lingo and the terminology and how they want to be spoken to, it's very much around who are they and splitting them up in different groups and then being able to speak their language. And this is where you can feed specific terminology and like what should it pick up on to be able to resonate with those groups. So that's how we think of like the layer for each persona where that translation happens. And then you personalize the comms enablement, everything with that specific context. And this is all done by AI, so it happens automatically and then it gets pushed out to them. So adding that another layer of personalization and translation, literally different types of languages becomes very key. And then what tends to happen is that change happens very fast. So very basic things like versioning tends to be very complex. And you also have cascading tends to break down very fast if you rely on a cascading way of getting information out, because you have things shifting, timelines are moving, and reorgs happen very often. So instead of having that cascading, it's easier many times to have employees have a go-to destination where they can always find the latest information and where you're in control of what they see at any point in time. And many use Teams. So when you think of like, where do we want to host the latest information, the source of truth for all of these initiatives, Teams tend to be a good option. And what you can do then is take different channels. For example, if you have biopharma R&D, say you're part of like clinical trial operations, anything that is an update to people working on clinical trial operations will be available for them immediately here. And then also tagging that source of truth to a tab where they can then always see what is the latest and greatest and the correct part in clinical trial transformation. So if you call that CTT, you would then have your CTT resources. They can always refer to this. So like mastering AI-assisted clinical trial management, everything here, the podcast, check-ins, videos, and so on, they can always refer to one source of truth. So being able to have that common place to refer to without having a few different versions, like emails, for example. Emails tend to be the worst thing because people miss half of them and then they search and then they find an old one and the right information is just never available. Whereas here, it's very easy to have exactly the right information at any point in time and just tag it to where they are. So they don't have to go anywhere else. They are right here and they just have all the resources available to refer to. So that's a good practice too, to have, especially when change is happening fast and at a very high speed, having that one live source of truth becomes important. Adoption then. How do we look at adoption? What are some good things to do here? So one thing that we've seen a lot of people do is like putting that adoption accountability where credibility lives, as we call it. Because especially in pharma, given this science and business combination, you would have credibility with certain leaders. For example, take a scientific audience. You might not have as much credibility with them if you're a change and transformation professional, for example. Differs by organization, but many times what we find is that it's important to have adoption being driven by people who are high on that credibility. So you can have some things being done by the central team. Usually they are designing frameworks, like the whole activation approach, making sure that there is central governance and that you have that overview of everything that is happening. And that also allows you to build for consistency and scalability. And that becomes key as well, because when you have so much change happening, being able to do that in a consistent way and most of all measure it in the same way becomes very critical. So you need some sort of central team to have that enterprise-wide view and cross-functional insight. But then pushing more of the adoption, execution, and so on to the business leaders and the champions, because it's impossible for a central team to run the execution for all of these hundreds of initiatives, right? So being able to have them own adoption within their function and actually giving them the tools to do so. I find many times that's the reason business sponsors or champions don't do as much as we might want them to is that they are not clear on what they should be doing, and also they don't have the tools to actually do so. And what you're able to do is to identify who is actually a champion, who is influential with these different groups, and then give them the tools to be a good champion. So when we think of take CTT again, you might have different groups that are in that initiative, say like this is affecting the clinical operations teams, for example. And then being able to give champions or leadership the tools to actually be a champion for this topic. So for example, you can add the champion network, the biopharma executives, perhaps. You can do different leadership dealing with clinical trial, L2, level 2. So if these are the type of groups that you're expecting sponsorship from, actually give them the tools to be a sponsor. And that includes creating content, sharing knowledge, pushing out like reminders and all of these things, everything activation wise, so that they have access to those activation tools. And then also giving them insight and data into what is actually happening. And then being able for them to filtrate down, like what is my champion network doing? What are my biopharma executives or clinical operations team, so that they can see team by team what is happening and what are they doing and what works and what doesn't work. Because we find many times when people have the data, when they have access to actually seeing what is going well, what is not going well, sponsorship, championness, all of that goes up, because it's very hard to be and I used to be a champion before I started Tigerhall. It was actually one of the reasons I started Tigerhall was that I was a regional leader in a large global organization, and I was a sponsor and a champion. And it was always just like, now go do this, like go execute this on the ground, without necessarily being given the tools to do so, or the clarity or the insight into the strategy or what's happening or what are we expecting. So being able to give them both the tools to execute, but also the data to know how should they improve and what actually works and doesn't becomes very critical. So give them more power than you might think. And then being able to deliver this, and this goes back to both them having the tools, but you can also do this centrally, is when we think of the enablement, the activation around adopting a change, there are two types of delivery criteria that we're seeing having the biggest impact. So you have one that is time-based and one that is behavior-based when it comes to when should a person get certain activation enablement. So if we take the scenario here, for example, you have an AI-assisted clinical trial management platform that is rolling out across clinops, investigators, data scientists. There are two types of buckets where you can look at when should a certain person get certain activation. So one is time, like it could be like the first time they're logging in, for example. So instead of having everyone go through, say, a 2-hour workshop or a training or like live instruction on something in March, but they get access to the platform in May, instead, every time someone logs in for the first time, that's when they get the enablement. So on that first platform login, you can time that. So the moment they do it, boom, right away, they get the activation. And then you might want to do check-ins like 15 days post go live, 30 days post go live. So think of like time-based as calendar-based and when they do certain things. But then the second here is also behavior-based. So behavior-based meaning what are they actually doing in the platform and in these systems, right? Maybe they're completing something, but they're not moving on from there, or they haven't done something in 2 weeks, or they have submitted something but not taken the next step. So anything that is behavior inside the system, really good to target based on as well, and especially frequency. And something that we noticed that works really well is actually to target based on what people aren't doing, because that's as important, right? So when we look at technology rollouts, we usually recommend to identify between 10 to 30 key behaviors. And then those are the ones that you want to make sure you have sustainment, reinforcement, and so on around. And if someone drops off, if they stop doing something, the system picks them back up, right? So being able to target based on what people aren't doing and within a specific time interval becomes very critical. So if we look at what that looks like, again, coming back to these like performing an event, and this connects to any kind of platform. So you can have any technology. We have 750 that are off the shelf. You can then feed data from that platform into your change activation platform. So if we take an example, and if for demo purposes, you have like maybe an SAP workflow again, deciding like what is that event. So we looked at this in the targeting. So let's say they have their cats complete, for example. This is not cats the animal, but like the type coding module within SAP, for example. And then the time window. So this is where this becomes important, right? So maybe you have within the last 30 days, and then if someone has not done it, so anyone who has not done this at all within the last 30 days, they now fall into a non-adoption group, for example. So all of this is dynamic, right? So based on how people are adopting platforms, working in systems, following process or not following process, all of that you can personalize based on here. So think of this as you set it up once. So your time goes into the strategy, the thinking, like what are those key behaviors that we want to drive? So this is usually a really good forcing mechanism to force people to think through, okay, what is it that we actually want to drive? What does success look like? What are those behaviors? What are the workflows? And then being able to select them here. And then being able to see like when someone is doing something or not doing something, or if doing one of a few different workflows, so different approvals, different stages, generating different things. It can be like any kind of workflow. And if they've done that at least like 10 times in, let's say, the last 7 days, this might be a champion group. So now you can see that these are people who are very active, doing it really well, using it a lot. How can we then pick them up to be champions? So it gives you this data about how people move between different groups over time, both who are doing something and who aren't doing something. So it's a direct view of adoption. So you can see right away adoption and how people move between the different groups. And many times what we see is that kind of really high adoption in the first like 2 to 3 months, for example, a new system. And that's usually when then sustainment and reinforcement stops. And people think, oh, people have adopted it. How great. Like now we don't have to do anything more here, like on to the next project. And that's when adoption starts to fall. So being able to set this up so that people have that sustainment, reinforcement over a long period of time. If you think of if it's something that people do once a year, they might need 5 or 6 years of reinforcement and sustainment if it's a new platform that they're using. If it's something that they are doing every day, like 1, 2, 3 months might be enough. But then after 30 days, if they fall out, the system picks them back up again. So looking at both those time-based, the first time they do something, but also the time intervals and the behaviors that they're taking in, for example, a clinical trial management platform, and seeing what are they doing, what are they not doing, and being able to personalize based on that. So this is what we're seeing being by far the biggest impact on change adoption is the time when someone gets it and being able to get it based on when they do something, but also who they are. So it's really the combination of all of those data points that makes it very effective. And then adaptation, so continuing the track on data and looking at how do we adapt to how people are adopting, how people are reacting, how the change is going, and overall what is happening. Let's start with looking at you and how do you currently do this today? So how do you currently measure when we think of that adaptation, when we think of adaptation, how do you measure whether the change is actually landing today? And if it's anything else than these, please feel free to put them in the chat too. Right, let's close and share the results. Okay, so 60% are either consistent measurement approach, don't have one, so we don't have a consistent measurement approach, or like training completion and attendance rate. We have a few like real-time adoption data by role in audience segment. That's really good. And then some post-launch surveys. Okay. Again, great idea of where we stand in the room. So looking at data then, and how do we adapt to different realities? A key thing here is a mindset shift in terms of what data and feedback and so on actually is. Because many think of this historically as a sequential kind of thing, and like feedback and data is the last thing that comes out, and that's kind of the judge and the test, like was it successful, was it not? Whereas actually the better way to think about data and feedback is that it's your input. It's your input into how can you improve, how can you do better, right? So think of things like personalization, targeting, what works, what doesn't work, where do we need to allocate resources. That's what the feedback and the data tells you. So it's far more than just an executive report for the steerco team or something to report it internally. And I find that unfortunately, many change and transformation teams think that's where it ends. So they think reporting, okay, great, we have a report, it's a receipt of what happened, and then they don't use as much of it as an input. So if we think of some of those areas, if we take the same scenario again, we have this clinical trial management platform rolling out across different groups. The signals that you're getting should trigger an action and a targeted intervention. And that's how you should use the data. And that could be, like what is the next step? Like who's ready to move forward? Who needs more support? So how do we move people through the change activation curve? And do we move some people faster because they might just get it, they're on with it? Like we don't have to overwhelm them with more and more change activation, right? Because they're already through it. Whereas others might be a bit slower. How can we give them more support? So that kind of targeted re-engagement with specific people, depending on how they react to it, is very, very critical. And then you have both quant and qual to this, right? So some examples here, like champion reporting, if you have like champion reporting and you see the qualitative feedback for that from them is like, when can we go back to how we did it before? Then you might want to equip certain leaders with talking points on how to improve that buy-in. So this is all about getting the feedback so that you can actually action it and see what is happening. And then looking at saturation across the portfolio as well, right? So that's another point of feedback, is seeing where we're seeing high saturation. It might be like collision points, same population running across so many different initiatives. What's on track? What's behind? Are we coinciding with other things? And being able to then plan better, escalate, redeploy, like thinking around it. So both of these areas, when it comes to both the change activation data and having this feedback loop and the overarching initiative view, is all around how do we do better and how do we improve. And looking at some of those data that is most helpful, there are tons of different data and like how you combine it and how you can slice and dice it. But just as a quick example to give you a more tactical idea, if we take feedback, for example, you have user comments. So then if you take user comments and then decide who do you want to know, like in terms of comments, questions, what they're doing, you can specify them different groups. Exactly who do you want to see the feedback from? So maybe you just care about your clinical operations teams, for example, and then you will get a report on exactly what their feedback is, what they're thinking, what their questions and concerns are. Or you can do a custom audience. So maybe you want to deep dive and see, hey, like we have this new initiative and I know it's affecting the people who report to Edward a lot. So let's look at all reporting lines, everyone who reports up to Edward, what do they think? What is their feedback? What are their thoughts? So again, when we look at that feedback data, being able to do that by group and by audience is not like a big like overarching feedback, because that tends to get very bland and very vanilla. Like if you take all the feedback together, like you get a good overall organizational sentiment, but it's not as helpful for you to then be able to actually go back and do the interventions. Because overall sentiment just tells you, okay, this is what people think and feel. Great. Now what do we do about that? Whereas here you can go much more granular. So let's say everyone who reports to Edward, maybe you want to see, people who are new, what do they think? If we take like that, not this one, if you take employee start date and people who started like before, say everyone who started before last year, and then getting to that specific feedback, because then now how are we actually going to engage them? And then going back to those groups that we looked at, this is exactly the same criteria you can set up. And coming to that response data, if you take then an answer, so if they say something like, let's say like try like a co-pilot prompt, for example, anything that they say in their feedback that contains, for example, coffee. Now you can target people who have any kind of feedback around the coffee, for example. So it's about using that data that you get out of it to then further enhance targeting and feedback. So it tells you a lot about what's going on and how can you prove that. And then on that second piece on resource allocation, being able to have views where you can actually see them at a higher initiative-wide level. How are projects tracking? What's the type of impact the different groups are experiencing? And most of all, this load. So being able to see, okay, the product team has a lot in May, for example, do we push something to June or July? So making sure that you're not overloading people at different points in time. And sometimes you don't have a choice, and that's completely fine, but at least having a view so that an executive sponsor can then make a decision like, hey, this might not be the right time to roll something like this out, for example. So it helps you with that planning view. So overall, tons of different data that then shows up in different graphs and forms and shapes so that you can do better targeting, better timely interventions, and being able to have organization-wide views like this. So that's how you can continuously adapt. And of course, getting all of this right makes you a lot faster to go to market. And speed tends to be the number one thing that we see in pharma companies right now that they really need is just like speed. How do we get to market quicker? How do we do trial completion quicker? How do we develop drugs quicker? So speed is ultimately the outcome. And the way to get speed right is through many times adaptation, being able to see what is going well, what is not going well, what are different people reacting to, how can we ensure that this team gets more of what they need earlier, and most of all, how often or how early do we know that we're having a problem? Because many times when you think of feedback, what we see many organizations do is they might do a survey 90 days later, or like here's an email inbox to send some thoughts, or it has to go like cascading, like reverse cascading all the way up, and you don't really get it real time, honest, and as good as it could be. And speed, like feedback loops, is really about how early do you want to know what's going well and what's not going well. And the earlier you get that feedback, the sooner you can make targeted interventions, the sooner you can do remediations and actually act on that feedback, right? So that's what ultimately increases the speed to market. And then, of course, when people are aligned, when they know that this is what my role is and what's expected of me, as well as the adoptions, it's really all of the three coming together that ultimately drives that speed. Adoption of new tools because people know why they should use it, and then you get feedback so you can intervene where it's not going well. And then, of course, the value realized. So when you're rolling out large transformation programs, it's usually a very big investment in making sure that the value is realized and that adoption stays over time. So there's not new things coming consistently, and then you're like hitting that high adoption and then just like crash after that. So it's a very high ROI on big investments that are being made across the board in this industry specifically. So some key takeaways and things to do to wrap up with. So looking at change as that portfolio, that's the biggest change we're seeing in terms of the mindset around how do we build this capability is no longer just like isolated projects, but it's around how do we have that true portfolio view. And then being able to have AI and technology do more execution, because that's really the real gap, and where many, especially now with the speed of change and the amount of change, if you need to do manual execution across so many initiatives, there's just no way. There's just very, very hard to do manual execution, all of those. Execution capacity is something to think about so that you can then move more into the strategy capacity. Because if you have good strategy and say you have 5 people and the 5 people you have can focus on strategy instead of running around and doing manual execution, that's really a big win. The language translation that we spoke about, so not just like function segmentation, but being able to change vocabulary, how they respond, like different languages, like how speaking in their vocabulary and their words becomes very important. The data as well, so being able to speak language of data and what are those adoption rates and how are people responding to it. And then the naming of it. We find that many like change management is not really a word that is used in this industry. And I think that that might be one of the reasons why it has more investment and is more developed in a more mature capability than it is in some other industries, is the fact that they don't really use the word change management. So things like strategy realization, value delivery, value realization, results delivery, all of these kind of words is what they use much, much more than any kind of change management. And so the internal positioning and internal reporting matters a lot. And we see in pharma, it's more leaders than in other industries who actually have a direct CEO reporting line as well. So the head of that value creation office or transformation management office or results delivery office, they tend to report up to the C-suite as well. So internal positioning matters. And again, coming back to that credibility, if you have a scientific audience, having credibility with them matters, and change management tends to, unfortunately, not evoke that much credibility with that kind of group. So looking at what we can do next. So looking at your own change portfolio, do you have the visibility? Do you know which audiences each one is hitting? Do you know what's going on starting there? The execution gap, do you have like how much time do you spend on manual execution? And just to drive adoption, alignment, like is that something you still do manually with spreadsheets and distribution lists and creating slides and hosting town halls? Is that still the manual route that you're in? Do you have any real-time feedback signals? Do you have anything that you can look at to drive that adaptation, or is it guesswork and you just put a finger in the air and think like, I think we probably need to do a little bit of this to make it go faster? Like, how do you really know how to make it go faster? Champion networks continue to always be important, always do well. What we recommend is thinking about how do you select those champions. Sometimes this can become a little bit of the teacher's pet exercise, and it's always the leaders' favorites that become these champions, even though they might not actually give a shit about the initiative. So being able to identify who's truly engaged, who really cares about this, who actually is influential with their peer group, and in each specific initiative. Because some organizations build champion networks as a like static thing, and this is the champion network for all change, which is not the best way to think about it. Because if you think of each initiative on its own with who's actually engaged and who's a true champion in this initiative, and engaging them in that way, and give them the tools, give them more powers than you might be comfortable with. Very key thing. And then start piloting this like role-based, timing triggered way of doing activation. So the timing, I keep coming back to the timing because it's really what drives the biggest difference. The personalization, the timely delivery, those are the things that we see has the by far highest impact on adoption rates across the board. So that's what I wanted to share. Tigerhall way of doing this, I've shown some examples. When you think of how it all comes together, you have context, you have those groups. We looked at some of the things that you can do around here. Then on that execution gap, Tigerhall takes care of creating all the content, delivering it to people where they are, when it matters, at the time that they need it. So taking it back to those, like when are they doing things? When are they onboarding into a new system? When do they haven't used a tool for 30 days? Like all of these workflow actions and triggers go into the delivery timing of it. And then automating all of that reinforcement, the sustainment, so you don't have to spend your time on chasing people or reminding people, like all of that is just run automatically, right? And then a ton of feedback. So a ton of feedback to actually be able to understand your different personas, your different audiences, what works, what doesn't work, who's a true champion, who might be resisting and why, how can you identify them and address it? And then that initiative overview to see, are you overloading people? Are they at capacity? How can you best allocate your resources? And how is your team's time best spent when it comes to how do you intervene and when? Because many times we see that as a result of this data, people go like, oh, like we just need to go and talk to this VP. And then like, that's all you need to do. Like it could feel like nothing is going well, but then like actually it's just the VP that is the particular issue. Or this is the set of questions that are unanswered, or these are the concerns people still have. So being able to allocate the interventions and be timely about those makes a big difference. And then coming back to this data being the input. So you get data as output, but then also using that in further targeting and further improving how you speak to different personas. How do you resonate with them? What do they need? How do you target them better? And then the strategy as well, when you see what actually works and what doesn't, that can also fine tune your strategy. So think of this as an always on loop where the system learns more and more about your organization, your audiences. So it gets faster and faster and better over time. And you also learn about what works, what doesn't work, so that it's this always on autonomous operating system that can just execute the change, make sure it happens, people get what they need, and you also get to understand what works and doesn't. So you can operate with that feedback loop. So that's what I wanted to share. Happy to answer any questions anyone might have on this or anything more tactical around what works and doesn't. Anything in the chat?
Okay, now, yeah. So we have a few questions in the Q&A section. So first question from an anonymous attendee. How granular can we get with the segmentation that Tigerhall uses? And do I have to add all of the data manually, i.e. start date?
No, good question. So this is all automatic data feeds. So you can go extremely granular. And that's when we look at these different data sources. These three, when you think of demographics, when you think of workflow actions, response data is what comes from Tigerhall. So all of this is captured by the platform. For demographics and workflow actions, it's all about what data you feed it. And this is a live feed, right? So there is no manual work. Like all of Tigerhall is like zero manual work. You just go in here and like you think through the criteria. So you think about, okay, who do we need to reach and when? And then you can go infinite. So on the question on granularity, you can get extremely granular. So some of these that we've looked at, like reporting line, for example, say you want people to report to Anthony and Charles and Edward and are 5 and 4 levels below, like that level of specificity. And then you have like on this thing with attributes, this is where you can have like any data that you have. So like job title, like if you're doing M&A, like people feel like legacy company. So if it's a company that's been acquired, are they coming from Horizon, for example? So you can target everyone from that Horizon company, and all these different attributes. It's really, the sky is the limit, and you can be super creative with how granular you get. The fewer criteria, the wider the audience. So if it's just, for example, everyone who has done this SAP workflow once in the last 30 days, that might capture a certain group, or just everyone who reports into Anthony, that's a broader group, or like everyone in the whole organization is, of course, the broadest. But then it's really when you start combining all of these that you can get super, super granular. So, for example, everyone who's written a Copilot prompt using the word coffee and is 5 or 4 levels below Anthony, Charles, and Edward, and is coming from Horizon. So you keep adding and statements, and that's how you get to very, very specific groups. And sometimes that might be 2 people, and sometimes it's 200. It's up to how many criteria you add. But what we recommend is to start with these, like the org-wide groups. So think like your foundational audiences, and your foundational audiences might be certain seniority levels or certain functions or departments. So that might be where you start. And then you can take any of those audiences and very easily add on things like workflow actions or response data or feedback or how they respond to a certain quiz or survey and things like that. So foundational audiences first, and then easy to add on. But yeah, super granular is the short answer, and no manual work.
And the other question we have is, how long does it take to get an initiative launched using Tigerhall?
So if you already have the platform up and running, then it's literally in a day. Like you can just like turn around and launch it. If you're just getting set up, we see anywhere from like 2 to 4 weeks usually. And that depends a bit on how mature are you in your change activation maturity overall. Or like, have you done, for example, some come in with like change impact assessments, and they have key messages, and they have audiences thought through and so on. So then actually setting it up and like getting it going is 3 to 4, maybe up to 6 hours. And we usually do that in like 1/2 day. So we would get together 1/2 day and do it. But we also have customers who might not have done that. And many that we work with, they don't have any kind of change capability at all. And then we can come in and we'd usually do a 1 to 2 day workshop, go deep, like think through these audiences. So this is usually where the most time goes, is thinking through the criteria for the different audiences. And that really comes back to strategy. So that's kind of the forcing function for thinking through, okay, what are we expecting out of this initiative? What do we really need people to do? What do we want to say to them? What are the key messages? What are the key takeaways? So you start from the end, and we start with what does success look like? What do you want to achieve? And then work backwards to actually setting that up in Tigerhall. So we're very hands-on and we're very there all the time to support. But how long time it takes depends a little bit on that maturity. But I think anywhere from a day to a month is probably the best answer, which I know is a broad range, but depending on those different criteria. Good question.
Those were the only two questions I learned so far.
All right. Sounds good. Then thank you everyone so much for your time and taking the time this afternoon. And if anyone wants to connect after this, my contact details are up here as well. So feel free to connect anytime. I'm always happy to chat change activation and share any tips and tricks or best practices or anything I can help anyone with anytime. So feel free to reach out and have a good rest of your day. And thanks again for being here this afternoon.